Hello, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now we're starting session 3 of the second topic, long distance trade, climate change and epidemics in the making of the modern world. And in this session, we're going to be looking at epidemic disease, giving rise to the early modern world. Okay, this is something that we introduced at the end of session 2, but now we're going to cover this quite fully. So let us transfer then to our lecture outline. And once again, this is something that we introduced in part 2 at the end, looking at, for example, the transition from epidemic diseases that were prior to the early modern world, prior to the rise of international trade, uh, regional or local phenomena, to now the rapid spread of epidemic disease across vast distances that will cover great portions of the globe. And so when we have that epidemic disease covering large geographical areas, this is when they turn pandemic, in other words, okay? All right, so let me explain in a nutshell before we delve into the two pandemics that we're going to be dealing with in this particular session, which is the Black Death and the uh, Amerindian population catastrophe. Let me explain just quite briefly some of the conditions that lead to the rapid spread of epidemics in human history. And there are several factors, and that is one is climate. There's certain types of climate that are more prone to generate and to rapidly reproduce certain strands of bacteria and viruses and microbes and so on among human populations. And those are the kind of the more humid type of climates, particularly the hot and humid. So the tropical regions of the globe tend to be far more ripe for the generation of epidemic disease. And that is because many of the bacteria that have flourished in human history are bacteria that flourish in areas where there's bodies of water, where there is pollution, particularly, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, pollution, but just the presence of moisture and humidity in the environment allows for the bacteria to reproduce, to thrive, and to spread quite rapidly. Okay, because that pretty much forms the basis, if you will, of that microorganism. This is in sharp contrast, let us just say, to more cooler areas where humidity is not as high, for example, and bacteria don't tend to linger so much, again, in cooler environments like highlands, for example. So again, this is extremely important to understand, and this is going to help us understand the pandemics that we're going to assess in this session. Now, another critical factor for the emergence of disease are animal species. And that is because all human epidemics derive from microorganisms, in this case, viruses, for example, bacteria, larvae, and so on, parasites, and so on, of all kinds, that animals carry. And animals have lived with those viruses for hundreds, if not thousands and millions of years. They have adapted to those microorganisms. They have developed resistance to them. But humans, on the other hand, have not developed those viruses. So whenever there's a transmission from the animal kingdom to the human kingdom, it is when humans are confronted with a new entity, so to speak, and because they don't have any immunity to them, this is when they get sick. And of course, we have serious illness, and of course, mortality rates. And this, of course, is something that has occurred more constantly ever since humans started domesticating animals. So animal domestication was a stepping stone for the rise of epidemic disease. When humans began to take animals from the wild, domesticating them, and they brought them to live in close proximity to them, in let's say farms or in grazing areas where they were actually tending the animals, or developing things like, for example, cattle ranches and so on, or for agricultural production. Once humans began to interact more directly with the animal kingdom in that fashion, this is when it became easier for those microorganisms to transfer onto the to the human kingdom. And of course, when that occurred, this is when we're going to see in history those episodes of outbreaks, for example, of epidemic disease. And epidemics as such is also the byproduct of urbanism. So we got weather, climate on one hand, but we also have the animal factor as well, domestication. But when we have massive outbreaks of epidemic disease, is precisely in areas where we find high concentrations of populations. Okay, that is again in urban environments, communities, towns, particularly cities. Again, cities, ever since the rise of cities in world history about 4000 BC, this is when we started looking at the rise of epidemic disease and outbreaks. And that is because when people live together, it was just so easy to transmit the disease from one person, that the person that was affected by the animal, for example, to transmit the virus onto their neighbors. And of course, because they're all living congregated together, and sometimes there's overpopulation in urban environments, then of course that turned into an epidemic outbreak. Okay. Urban environments also, keep in mind, were not only overcrowded, those were also areas where people tend to pollute a great deal their environment as well, particularly before the modern world. Even before the 20th century, let us just say when you look, for example, at the 19th century, even the 18th century, when we look at just, prior to the recent times, still, most cities, even in the developed world, in the developed industrialized world, were not places where we find, for example, waste management systems or sewage systems, recycling of anything like that. So human beings in cities tended to pollute their environment with waste and human feces, of course. There were also animals in the cities as well. So there were no public health measures, let us just say, for hygiene, for disease control, etc. I mean, those kinds of measures that we have today just didn't exist back before the 20th century, much less before the modern world. So again, just because cities tended to be very, very polluted, very overcrowded, that was just a breeding ground for bacteria and germs, microbes, viruses, etc., producing a wide array of different conditions that, for the most part, particularly before the early modern world, people were not aware of. In other words, they were not aware of how the disease was produced, or how to actually treat it. There was no scientific, system of microbiology that people understood very well. Disease prevention, hygiene measures, for example, washing their hands with, antibacterial soap and detergents, etc. All of that just didn't exist. So people were very, very unaware of this microbial world. And so therefore they were totally exposed to it and unable to identify it. And they were suffering, of course, from time to time of epidemic disease. And as such, they just didn't have any system of categories by which they will label a particular disease, in order to identify it and be able to actually keep a record of. Again, so very rare do we find records of epidemic outbreaks in the ancient world. For the most part, people believe that those were actually, divine punishments. Those were actually, again, retribution of the gods, or, acts of sorcery or the devil, etc. Again, just part of the worldview of the pre-modern world. Now, Another factor for the rapid spread of epidemics, even outside of cities, when we see the rapid spread of epidemic disease into a series of communities, a series of kingdoms, had to do with improved transportation. Once we started looking at, for example, in the first session of this topic, looking at the global trade networks tying societies together in different parts of the globe, with improved transportation systems as well, particularly navigation, what we're going to see is that this international commerce that is on the rise leading up to the 1500s was also responsible for the rapid spread of epidemic disease, because now, instead of a disease affecting one locality as it had been doing that, and it has been happening in the past, before 1500, now germs are traveling along the network. As merchants are moving commercial goods, they're not only moving commodities and luxury items, they're also moving ideas, but at the same time, they're also moving germs as well. So this is going to be yet another factor why epidemic disease by, let us just say, the 13, 14, and 1500s and beyond turned into pandemics. And it is here that we're going to examine the first two pandemics in world history, the Black Death and the Amerindian population catastrophe that was produced by a series of viruses that affected the Native American population more specifically, how those two pandemics caused the disintegration of the old world, the pre-modern world, and paved the road for the emergence of the modern world, the world that we live in today. This is what we're going to be, again, examining quite closely in this session. So let us start with the first pandemic, and that is the Black Death. It was technically known as the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague, although turned into a pandemic in the 1300s that affected most of Eurasia, Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, Europe, even parts of North Africa as well were affected by that. Well, the bubonic plague had early iterations in earlier centuries. For example, one of the first ones that we have records of occurred in the eastern capital of the Roman Empire. That was the city of Constantinople, and it ended up affecting most of the eastern Mediterranean world. And that was an outbreak that began roughly around 541 and will span all the way to 549. It was called the Justinian plague because it occurred during the time of Emperor Justinian. Yeah, and so people actually call it the Justinian plague, but it was actually a bubonic plague because the symptoms that were recorded in terms of people exhibiting, for example, blue spots or dark spots in their bodies. This is the effect of the plague affecting their vascular system. Their blood vessels are swollen, and there is internal hemorrhage, for example, internal bleeding, for example, and of course that is what actually was causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, there were thousands of people dying in the city of Constantinople every week, and at the height of the plague. And so from there, it spread across the eastern Mediterranean. And by the time the plague subsided in 549, it is estimated that about 25% of the population of the entire eastern Mediterranean world died from this plague. So this was a plague that took a heavy toll, but it did not really spread outside because, once again, even up to this time, trade was rather intimate and limited. Even though we see the development of certain trading networks, those had not yet been developed to the point that they were. as we move into the commercial revolution of the 13, 14, 1500s and beyond. There was another iteration of the Black Plague, or the Black Death, as it was called, in Asia, in China, on the coastal cities of China. There was another outbreak that lasted for a few decades, from 762 all the way to 800 AD. Likewise, we see reports of people exhibiting the same symptoms, the same characteristics, and the like, and there was also a great dying as well. But in both instances, what we see is a certain limitation to the ability of the plague to expand beyond its locality. Okay, so those were very much regional and localized phenomena that did not really spread much into the rest of the world. And did not spread much into the rest of the world because, on one hand, there were, of course, certain measures that people enacted to confine, let us just say, or to contain the plague. And one of them was quarantine, for example. Even though people were not aware of the causes of the disease, they were kind of intuitively aware that they had to stay away from people that had gotten the illness or the sickness. And so people that had been exposed or were already going through the symptoms and so on were confined to certain areas, and they barricaded, for example, certain areas of town or certain communities and so on. So that was one. But the most important reason why those diseases did not spread much around the world is because of the confinement by distance, that is to say. And that is that still up to this time, almost every region and culture and civilization was pretty much separated in space and time through vast distances, in which there was very limited contact between those societies, cultures, and civilizations. Okay, so just the fact that still up to this time, many of the civilizations of the world were developing in almost splendid isolation, that was really one of the factors that prevented epidemics to turn into pandemics. Okay, so we have early iterations of the bubonic plague, but not yet, again, with the conditions of spreading beyond their borders. But this is about to change, and this is about to change for several reasons. We're going to see the bubonic plague becoming a true pandemic, in fact, the first pandemic in world history, as a result of different factors that came together to produce the ripe conditions for a true pandemic to occur. One of those had to do with climate change. Okay, so the change of climate, something we explained in session 2 with the nomadic invasions, for example, the Mongols invading China or the Vikings invading Europe and so on. This is a cool cycle, a cooler climate that affected the world, from, let us just say, from 850 all the way to the very early 1300s. This is going to have a profound effect in world civilizations. One was, again, the nomadic invasions that we already talked about. The nomads living in the northern globe, experienced a shortage of animals. There were pastoralists, and the scarcity of rainfall during this cycle produce also a shortage of grasslands as well. And so that caused the nomads to raid the civilizations and take over them. But there was another effect of the cooler climate, and that is that it affected certain animal species as well, in terms of limiting their water resources, their water supplies. And as their water supplies were dried up because of the lack of rainfall, then they started moving from their habitat, and they started now moving into settlements. They started moving into rivers where there were farms, where there were towns and cities. In other words, the agricultural civilizations and the interaction, once again, between this animal species that had lived pretty much isolated and separated from human populations, and now moving to human populations. This is going to generate, of course, a transmission of a virus that led to the bubonic plague. In this case, we're talking about rodents. And specifically, we're talking about rodents that inhabited the northern region of Asia, the northern mountains particularly. And they were very much affected by the cooler climate. As the water resources started drying up, the rodents began to move out of their habitat and they started moving towards bodies of water. And in this case, they started moving towards the largest rivers of China, the Yellow and the Yangtze River, for example. So they're moving in the pursuit of this resource for survival purposes. But they were carrying with them a particular strain of virus that they had grown resistant to, but humans had absolutely no immunity to as well. Okay, and that is the bubonic plague. Now, as they're moving into China and they're flooding now the different settlements and towns of China and so on, the rodents, they are not going to transmit the disease directly onto humans, but rather it was the fleas that they carried. So the fleas that they carried will serve as a bridge for the disease to jump from the rodent onto the human organism. So how this happened? Well, just the lack of hygiene during this time everywhere around the world. Again, remember that towns were rather polluted. We have polluted cities in many cases by the standards of 20th and 21st century modern societies. Most towns and cities of the pre-modern world, even the early modern world as well, were very, very much polluted. And so this allowed for the easy transmission of fleas onto human organisms. In other words, that as the rats were finding refuge in the towns, in the homes of people, and so on, their fleas are now jumping from the rodent onto the humans. And of course, when they do that after having bitten the rodent, because they feed upon, of course, the bloodstream of the rodent and they ingest, again, the virus. And now when they jump into humans, they are also biting humans. And when they bite humans, they're now transmitting the virus into their bloodstream. Again, this is pretty much how it works. The process is a little bit more complex and more complicated, of course, of how this is occurring. But this is just in very general terms how the transmission took place. So we're going to have an outbreak in China as we move into the 1300s. Again, so the rodents are leaving their habitat around 1200 AD. They're moving into those rivers. There's a massive migration and so on. But what we see is that by 1331, there's already an outbreak of the bubonic plague in China. So this is, again, the starting point of the bubonic plague, China. Okay? And so this is, again, where people exhibit those blue spots in their bodies, and they are turning dark and black, again, as a result of their blood vessels breaking down. They have gangrene, what is called an internal hemorrhage as well. And people die rather quickly, and they die within days. And again, so this is the starting point. And whereas in the past, it would have been something that will stay confined, within the cities that were affected by the bubonic plague. Now, as we're going to be moving into this new era, again, of global networks, this is going to really now turn into a pandemic, because merchants will be traveling back and forth from China to Southeast Asia by boat, carrying goods, particularly silks and ceramics and the like. They're also moving into the Indian subcontinent and beyond. And as merchants are exchanging products from one part of the network onto another, they're also exchanging, of course, the disease. And in many cases, this is exchange because merchants, whenever they load up cargo, uh, more often than not, there were sometimes rodents or rats moving into those boats or into the ox carts, for example, where people carry things like teas or spices and the like. And the rodents were traveling along the network as well. And also because of the fleas as well. Remember, it's not necessarily the rat, but also the flea that was responsible for jumping from the rat onto humans. And of course, this was leading to further expansion of the disease along the trading networks. Okay, so this is how the bubonic plague is beginning to become a true pandemic. Eventually, as we'll see, this is going to reach the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, and eventually this disease entered also Western Europe as well. Now, there are two critical factors for the pandemic outbreak. Why suddenly in different parts of the world there's going to be a mass dying, for example, of the bubonic plague? Well, one had to do with the cooler climate that I just explained. During the cooler climate, remember, there was less rainfall, so therefore agricultural production went down in different parts of the world. And when that occurred, with less agricultural production, we have, of course, shortages of food, sometimes leading to famine. So people are not well nourished. And when people are not well nourished, their immune systems tend to be compromised. So we have in different spots of the globe agricultural societies that were largely affected by the cooler climate, in that because of the shortage of food, they also were experiencing a weaker immune system as well. Okay, so this is extremely important. Okay, and so when the bubonic plague hit, they were not physically strong, or they were not physically prepared to combat the disease, develop antibodies, and survive the disease. And of course, there's going to be a mass dying. Okay. The other factor for the pandemic outbreak, how this is turning really into pandemics, is, as just explained a moment ago, is that they're already set in place long distance trade networks. And this is something that the Mongol Empire in particular was able to consolidate. The global trade networks were already there, but the Mongol Empire pretty much seized control of the network that connected Asia with the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, all the way to Eastern Europe, and facilitated the movement of goods, provided protection along the networks, and sponsored merchants to conduct trading activities on a much faster rate. And because of that, what we see is the massive expansion of the bubonic plague along the World Trade Network that the Mongol Empire controlled. And again, this really turned this epidemic into a global event. For the first time, we can talk about pandemics now. And as you can see, those are the routes that the merchants cross merchandise from one area to another. And as well, those are the specific regions that were mostly affected by the Black Death as well. In other words, if you really want to have an accurate, let us just say, map of the settlements, communities, towns, and so on that were affected by the bubonic plague, all you need to do is just look at the networks of commercial exchange. Because as the merchants were moving from one end of the network to another, from one trading outpost to another, they were spreading the disease along the network. And this is where we see mass death taking place. Okay, whether we're talking about Central Asia or India subcontinent or Europe, again, it's all the same. Again, that the towns that suffered the most from the Black Death were the towns that were connected to the network. Okay, and those that were outside, particularly human societies that live in the countryside, for example, or in the highlands, in the colder environments, for instance, or just far removed from this international network were the societies least affected by it. Okay, so this is again pretty much tying together economic systems. We're tying together climate, in this case, climatic changes as well, and we're also tying epidemics all into a single system. Now, the global effects of the plague. What were the global effects? Well, when it comes to China, for example, we see 30% population decline. Okay, so this is a society that was over 100 million people. And again, a reduction of 30% was significant. And we see that this led to starvation because a great many people that used to work in the hydraulic systems, in the river maintenance, for example, maintaining the canals, in the irrigation systems, the levees, and so on, were dying. So as a result of that, this led to also shortages of food and mass starvation, which really compounded the problem of the Black Death, because with starvation, we have weakening immune systems as well. Another very important effect in China itself of the Black Death was that the ruling group, this ruling conquering group, the Mongols, that had seized China and were governing this very large empire, was also weakened by the Black Death. As many of the Mongol army generals, for example, in top military leadership, were dying. A great many of them, and many of the administrators as well, were dying from the Black Death. And as a result, the Mongols began to lose their legitimacy to rule, because in China, if you recall, this is something we covered in the first topic. In China, there has been a certain ideology, otherwise known as the mandate of heaven. Again, this is the ideology that served to legitimize the ruling dynasty, or the ideology that also served to topple a ruling dynasty as well. Because remember, what this ideology stated, it was that the ruling dynasty received the right to rule from heaven. And as long as things were okay in the world, there was stability, there was, agricultural production, the kingdom was protected, and so on, then the ruling dynasty will continue to rule for the time to come. But whenever conditions changed, whenever there were wars, invasions, for example, whenever there were famine or a plague and so on, catastrophes in the natural world, then those were signs that the ruling dynasty had fallen out of favor from heaven, and it was time to change it as well. So this led to the fall of the Mongol dynasty, otherwise known as the Yuan dynasty, and that was really in the midst of the Black Plague in 1368. What we're going to see is that this dynasty now is toppled, and we're going to see a new one replacing it in China. So again, this led to really the fall of the Mongol Empire. This is extremely important, how a pandemic really can produce shattering events like the shattering of the Mongol Empire. India also suffered a great population decline. About 35% of its population was also, again, shattered as well. Here, the main issue in India was that many of the towns and cities of India were highly concentrated. They were densely populated. That is to say, there's a high concentration of people in cities, overcrowded and overpopulated. And that facilitated the spread of epidemic disease, again, in particularly in the urban environments, the urban areas of India. And again, India was also over 100 million inhabitants, and we see a sharp decline as well of population. Now, in terms of Europe, there are far more records that we have available about the effects of the Black Death in Europe. We know that the Black Death decimated about 40% of European population from, let us just say, a population that before the arrival of the Black Death was about 75 million people. 75 million people. It was a population that during the cooler climate, this global climatic change that we referred to in the past, had led to food shortages in Europe and also famine. So what we have is a population with a compromised immune system. So again, this was really a population that was ill nourished. And this is very well documented. Again, even before the Black Death showed up. Again, so there are other factors that also explain why we see a true pandemic in Europe, as well as we move into the 1340s, particularly. And that is because of the type of house construction in Europe. For example, in the Italian peninsula, this is going to be the entry point of the Black Death because of the trade networks. Again, the house construction was such that, for example, people tended to live overcrowded in residential compounds. There were more than 20 people living together, let us just say, in one house. Okay, and there were perhaps one or two families or an extended family, for example, living in just one house. So they were highly concentrated, very densely concentrated areas. Also, there were certain homes that were built in ways that many rodents found refuge there as well because of the type of construction. They were living inside the houses, in other words. And people kind of grew accustomed to have those kinds of, rodents being present even inside of their homes as well. So even the rodents were living inside the houses as well. When we add to this, for example, the poor hygiene as well, that we don't find, for example, hygiene awareness during this time. It was not uncommon for people in Europe to carry fleas in their bodies. As a matter of fact, people also kind of accepted that as part of the reality of life and the like. And of course, the pollution in the environments as well. Many of the rivers of Europe had been polluted with human waste, for instance. So there was breeding grounds for the dissemination of germs and microbes of all kinds. So again, this was the condition of Europe just before the plague arrived. And now the plague arrives in Europe precisely because of the trade networks that I just explained. And how this occurred is that there were merchants that were trading between Italy and the Eastern Mediterranean. There was a merchant city known as Kaffa in the Eastern Mediterranean, as you can see here. And there was, of course, very strong links between the Italian merchants of Genoa and Venice with Kaffa. And that involved, in this case, the spice trade, spices. And it had become so important, the city of Kaffa, that there were groups of Turks in the Middle East that wanted to seize the city. So when the Black Death was raging on, we have a new war over the city of Kaffa. The Turks are trying to take over the city, and they put the city under siege. And in the midst of this fighting, a lot of the Turkish soldiers started dying from the plague. They started dying. And so, not knowing what was really going on, the Turks kind of got panicked, to say the least, and they wanted to get rid of their the corpses, the bodies. And one of the way that they were trying to get rid of the bodies, in order to not only get rid of the bodies, but also to affect the people inside of Kaffa, was by throwing the bodies inside of the city, because they kind of understood that, well, if those soldiers were dying because there's something in them that perhaps can get somebody else sick, in other words. So they were using catapults, again, and pretty much catapulting the corpses onto the city of Kaffa. Again, this was an event that was known as the flying corpses of Kaffa. Again, the flying corpses. And as the corpses were catapulted into the city, now in just a matter of days, suddenly there was an outbreak of the Black Plague inside of the city. And of course, this led for the fall of the city. And, people are now trying to flee. They're panicked. And many of the merchants that of Venice and Genoa that were in there, they were picking up spices. They left. They managed to escape. And when they escaped and went back to Italy, they arrived, yes, but most of the crew had already died along the way. And those were actually ghost ships, as a matter of fact. So again, they were able to arrive because there was just a handful of people alive in those ships when they arrived with a cargo of spices. But once again, most of the crew had already died. Of course, the cargo, the spices was seized, but in the cargo there were rodents. Okay, there were rats, and when they moved the rats again into the mainland, they found an environment that was ripe, if you will, for them. There were actually homes that contained rodents and so on. And they started spreading the fleas, and that led to a massive outbreak, something that got started in Italy. Again, once again, Italy will be the home of the arrival of the Black Death in Europe. And as the merchants were moving spices across the Mediterranean, for example, and also into the mainland, into places like the Iberian Peninsula, France, for example, and beyond, even England, parts of Central Europe, there will be spreading, of course, the Black Death along the network as well. So the European merchants unknowingly were also spreading the plague because as they were carrying cargo and merchandise, they were carrying fleas, and those fleas were already infected with the bubonic plague. Okay, and so if you see the map of Europe, the areas that were largely and mostly affected by the bubonic plague were areas where there were meeting points, trading outposts for the Italian merchants that were selling spices. Again, this was caused by the spice trade, so to speak, this pandemic. Again, so now what's interesting to note is that in the midst of all this, there was yet another pandemic that broke out. It was known as the pneumonic plague. It was a plague that affected mostly the respiratory system. And that was also, again, as a result of the compromised immune systems as a result of this malnutrition. So while some people were dying from the Black Plague, others were also dying from this pneumonic plague that was transmitted more airborne. Again, and so we have a dual pandemic that was taking a heavy toll on the European population. Once again, it is estimated that 40%, some scholars indicate that even 50% of the European population died, from 75 million. Again, so it was a great reduction of population. Okay, so what were the effects of the pandemic in Europe? What were the effects of the pandemic in Europe? All right, so once again, anywhere between 40 to 50% population decline. Most people were dying in cities rather than in the countryside. So again, the countryside was like a safe place, as a matter of fact. Okay, a lot of rich people actually left. Rich merchants, for example, left their cities and moved into the countryside in order to escape the Black Death. Again, so we have the creation of villas, for example, all across the countryside during this time. Okay, and that explains why. Just like in India, for example, the dense populations tend to be mostly affected by this process. We also see a psychological trauma. In Europe, on a collective level, people are feeling guilty, not being able to understand what was really going on, why so many people were dying, why so many relatives, friends, acquaintances, neighbors were dying, in great numbers rather quickly. People are going to develop a certain traumatic memory from the Black Death, and they ascribe the causes of the Black Death to divine punishment for something that they felt had, they were, doing against God, for example, not praying enough, not being, good Christians and the like. Again, so there is the feeling of guilt, and there's also the impulse for redemption, meaning that in Europe, people are feeling that the way that maybe we can overcome this is if we redeem ourselves, if we correct, the trespasses, the sins that we have committed against God in this case. So again, there were masses offered, in the Catholic churches, for example, across Europe, to call God, to appease God, to call God for help, for example. This was something that was rampant, pervasive in Europe. There were also people that felt guilty and wanted to kind of inflict self-punishment. Those were known as the flagellants. The flagellants, again, were people that were whipping their backs, and they were moving from town to town and doing prayers and so on, and just whipping their backs and bleeding them. In other words, like, trying to kind of like punish themselves for something that they felt was going to take the pandemic away. Again, and when those things did not work, there's also reports that some people were actually going to cemeteries, for example, in order to perform ceremonies to appease the devil, because they believe that this was not really the act of God, this was the act of the devil. And what we need to do, they said, we need to appease the devil. So what we have is, again, a series of different rituals and ceremonies people doing in cemeteries or out in the woods in order to, appease the devil as well. And because that was part of the worldview, the general worldview at the time, there was some form of supernatural cause for the disease. And this led, number three, to the weakening of the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church was supposed to be the divine institution representing God on earth, that the administrators, from the Pope to the cardinals to the archbishops, bishops, priests, the friars, the missionaries, were all agents of God that could intercede with the divine to appease, for example, events in this world, appease, for example, the forces of nature, to try to control them, to try to produce rain, or to make a certain catastrophe go away again. So whenever the church administrators were, on one hand, dying in great numbers, they themselves were dying. There's a great dying among the church hierarchy. A lot of priests were dying, a lot of members of the church were dying, and on the other, that they were unable to appease the natural forces. They were unable to make this pandemic go away. Well, then a lot of people started really questioning this institution rather seriously. Again, their faith started really shaking. And this is going to lead later on, of course, to questions about, what is real knowledge? Maybe what we need to develop is a real science, they said, like modern science. The rise of modern science, for example, had a lot to do with the Black Death, because obviously people were trying to come up with a new system to understand the natural world and trying to control it other than through religion. In other words, so again, religion will be largely questioned by the Black Death. As a result of mass death, of course, there is now the image of death becoming now mainstream and popular. This is leading to the image of the Grim Reaper. The Grim Reaper is now becoming really a popular icon in Europe because of the mass death. And this is where we get, even today, the imagery of the Grim Reaper comes from the bubonic plague. Again, so it has cultural effects, again, in questioning religion, but at the same time, promoting the image of death as a natural occurrence. It's just that is natural, in other words. Okay. Number four, this is very important, is that the Black Death also helped end feudalism in Europe, because remember that feudalism was really an arrangement between landowners and commoners, peasants. Landowners providing protection to the peasants and peasants paying for that protection. Now, as there's mass death among the peasantry, there's going to be a scarcity of labor. And also, there's going to be plenty of land, because even landowners were dying and their peasants were dying. So now there's more land available. So now many peasants that were tied to their landowners paying tribute are now fleeing those arrangements, and they're moving into vacant lands. They said, well, we don't want to pay tribute anymore to this landlord. Maybe we do have options. Maybe if I can move to this other land that is vacant, nobody's really working there, nobody's living there again, I can actually move away from this. So this is going to gradually dismantle that economic institution, the feudal institution, and gradually this is going to pave the road for the arrival of capitalism, of land ownership, people owning land and controlling their own land, as opposed to working for a landowner and paying tribute to the landowner. Okay. So again, keep that in mind. This is really paving the road to the arrival of a new time. All right. So the fifth point, or the fifth change or effect that we're going to get to see, is the increased international trade, because now merchants, instead of just confining their commercial activities to their region, now, as people are dying in great numbers, they're going to be looking and searching for new consumers, new markets. Well, if people are dying in Europe and not many people are actually purchasing our products, what merchants are going to start doing is that they're going to now increase their international expeditions. And they're going to be moving abroad. They're going to be moving into other areas, looking for markets and so on, where they can sell their products. So this is going to, again, create a new economic system, something we're going to get to see, mercantilism, down the line after the 1500s. There's also the commercialization of land and wool industry as well. And as more land becomes available because people are dying, well, there's going to be certain merchants that are going to be moving into certain lands and using the land for commercial purposes. They're going to turn it into an enterprise. And one of the most common forms of enterprise was wool production. For example, moving sheep into a land, graze it, and then sell the wool to the manufacturers. In this case, well, of course, there were no factories back then. There were just artisans that were turning wool and wool thread into clothing, for example. And we're going to see, again, the rise of a new industry, the wool industry. This is going to be central for the upcoming industrial revolution and the arrival of capitalism as well, when people are turning the land into an enterprise, commercializing with that, and creating manufacturing as well. Okay, so there are great changes that are occurring in Europe as we see, of course, this great pandemic. Now, the other pandemic I want to discuss here is the one that took place in the Western Hemisphere, in the American continent. We are going to experience from 1500 to 1650 a great population catastrophe among the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas. This is otherwise known as the Amerindian Great Dying. Here, we're not going to identify a single virus that was responsible for the death of millions of people in the Americas, but rather there will be a variety of different strands of viruses that will be affecting the population. And depending on what region we're actually looking at and at what time, people are going to be dying in great numbers as a result of those viruses. Viruses that were introduced mainly by the arrival of the Europeans after Christopher Columbus in 1492. All right, so let's look at the geographical setting of the Americas in order to identify, for example, just basic, for example, demographic information, and also some of the topography, for example, as well, of this area. Well, when Columbus arrived, it is estimated that this continent housed anywhere between 60 to 120 million people. Again, so the most conservative estimate is about 60 million. Now, there are far more conservative estimates as well. Again, but conventionally, it is estimated that it is between 60 million, and the most liberal figure will be 120 million. Again, those are peoples that inhabited the continent, let's just say from present-day Alaska all the way to South America, including the Caribbean islands altogether. Okay, it is a continent that was isolated from the rest of the world because the connections of this continent had been broken in the distant past. Connections that connected, for example, Alaska and Siberia about 25,000, perhaps more years ago. There was a certain land bridge that connected those continents. That connection had been lost, broken. So why this is important is because for thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of the Americas were developing their societies, their cultures in splendid isolation from the rest of the world. There was no contact, in other words, between the Amerindian population with the populations of the old world. And so what that meant is that there is no sharing, in other words, of viruses, bacteria, and microbes. So there was never really, again, epidemics or the kinds of epidemics that the Europeans brought had not yet developed in America. So the Native American population never really developed immunity or resistance to those viruses. Okay, so this is going to be central, the isolation. We also have, at the same time, diverse geographies. What that means is that there is very different type of topographies, ecological systems. Particularly, there are lowlands and there are highlands. Why this is important is because in the lowlands, we're going to see the more hot and humid environments, for example, that will become ripe for the spread of disease. And there's also plenty of highlands as well, mountainous regions, for example, like the Andes. In Central America, there's also mountains as well. And people who tended to create their communities on the highlands will be less affected because of the colder climate as well. So again, keep that in mind as we're going to be moving along this discussion of pandemics in the Americas. Another issue is the lack of animal domestication. And the fact is that in the Americas, we're not going to find the kind of animal species that lived in other areas of the world. In other words, here in the American continent, we don't find, for example, cattle. There's no horses, sheep, goat, hens, for example, pigs, and so on. Those animal species don't exist in the Americas. So again, there were never animal farms, in the Americas. So the transmission of disease from animals to humans was not, present in the Americas. The only animal that was domesticated, once again, was the llama, in South America. That's the only exception. Now, this didn't mean that there were no diseases in the American continent prior to Columbus. There were. And the Amerindian diseases, again, were things like, for example, tuberculosis, dysentery, and syphilis. Again, we know for a fact that those were actually generated here in the Americas before the Europeans. So there were certain viruses that had affected populations from time to time. Now, in Europe, on the other hand, when we have animal domestication that has taken place for several thousands of years, again, the domestication of cattle, for example, the domestication of the horse as well, pigs, sheep and goat and hens and so on. We have, of course, cattle ranching, we have animal farms that created the conditions for the proliferation of certain epidemics. Those were actually viruses transmitted from animals onto humans. Things like, for example, smallpox. Smallpox is also otherwise known as chickenpox, for example, as well. It's transmitted by chickens. Influenza, cholera, and the plague. And the plague we talked about is transmitted by rats via the fleas, for example. Influenza, cholera will be transmitted by the presence as well of, for example, cattle as well, horses and the like, pigs and so on. So what we see is that Europe for many, many centuries have had outbreaks of epidemic disease, and even though they have suffered great, massive population declines in the past, the survivors of those diseases were able to develop a certain degree of immunity and pass on that immunity through their genes to their descendants. Okay? And so, again, they were subject to a series of epidemics in the past, of course, but because they were so much exposed by those viruses, they had developed a certain degree of immunity, which served them to kind of survive. Every time a European will get sick from smallpox, it was not a sure thing to die, for example. It was be more likely for them to survive, the episode, and the contrast here is that the Native Americans are not going to have that kind of advantage. Okay, so when the Europeans arrived in 1492, And they arrived, in this case, Columbus. And then after Columbus, we're going to see the first Spaniards arriving to the Caribbean islands. And those are really the Caribbean islands like Hispaniola, for example, and Cuba, will be the very first regions that the Spaniards occupied, and they built colonial towns, and they started interacting with the Native Americans there in that region. This is when we're going to see the very first population catastrophe occurring. In other words, this is the beginning stages of this population catastrophe, and that is in the Caribbean islands again, with outbreaks of influenza and dysentery affecting the Native American population. We see that from 1492, let it just say from 1492 to 1518, the population of the island of Hispaniola, which is present-day Dominican Republic and Haiti, which contained about 500,000 indigenous inhabitants, went from 500,000 in 1492 to zero, okay, in 1518. Okay, and totally depopulated again, totally from the original inhabitants, and that was because there was absolutely no resistance to those diseases again. Now, the disease will eventually reach the mainland. The Spaniards are beginning to take voyages, short expeditions into the mainland, sending navigators, sending merchants, and explorers, and of course conquistadors to look for settlements, to look for areas where they have gold, in other words. And as the Spaniards are arriving to the mainland, to the coastline, interacting with the natives, we're going to see the disease spreading through the trade networks, because there were trade networks that the indigenous peoples of the Americas had built for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there was already a certain kind of highway that connected, let us just say, Central Mexico with Central America, South America, including Central Mexico with the American Southwest as well. Okay, and so the disease will be spread across the network, because as the indigenous societies were moving goods from one area to another, they're also moving the germs, the viruses that they had become exposed to as well. And this is going to lead eventually to the fall of two great empires, really the only empires that existed in the Americas at the time of the contact with the Europeans. We already saw, for example, how in Asia the bubonic plague led to the fall of the Mongol Empire. Now we're going to see how in the Americas, we're going to see the fall of the Aztec and the Inca empires, which had been built recently. Those were recent systems that had been formed from the 12 to the 13 in the early 1400s. So those were actually new kinds of empires. We start with the Aztec Empire that was confronted with the Spaniards in a kind of type of like a massive conquest mission, so to speak, that the Spaniards were engaged in. And this empire will fall from 1519 to 1521. Again, this is an empire that the Spaniards had heard of in the Caribbean from the inhabitants, the original inhabitants of the Caribbean, informed them about this great empire that had a lot of gold. So they sent, of course, an expedition. The governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, sent one of the military commanders, in this case, Hernán Cortés, a sort of conquistador, to actually verify this report. So Hernán Cortés was sent to Mexico to meet the rulers of the Aztecs in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Again, this is the city of the lake that we explored in the first topic of the semester. The Aztecs, again, built a great city in the lake, in the middle of the lake. Tenochtitlan, again, it contained about 250,000 people. So this was really a huge populated area. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's highly concentrated, and is concentrated in an island as well. Okay, so again, 250,000 people. Hernán Cortés will be sent. Eventually, he is going to be marching into the city of Tenochtitlan with about 1,000 soldiers. He initially comes with 500 soldiers, but then later on, An additional 500 soldiers are sent, and they're sent to arrest Cortez, but he managed to convince them to join the expedition. So, at the end of the day, he's only with a very small force of only 1,000 soldiers. 1,000. Again, they do possess certain advantages that the natives don't, and that is steel technology. They have armors, shields, swords, for example, the horse as well. And the Aztecs don't have anything of that. Again, they still operating with bows and arrows and axes and the like. Again, the other advantage that they possess is Indian alliances as well. The Spaniards, Cortez is able to build alliances along the way. People that actually hated the Aztecs, so to speak, joined the expedition, and they moved into the capital. Okay, they moved into the capital, and when they show their true colors in terms of why they were there for the gold and to take over the region and so on. The Aztecs led a massive attack against the Spaniards, and the Spaniards were now on a retreat. They were expelled from Tenochtitlan, in other words, outside the city, with some heavy losses along the way. Now, that happened in 1519. Now, in 1519, they regroup the Spaniards and they put the city under siege. They surround it. Again, they put it under siege, and they're trying to build vessels, boats, in order to actually move their forces into the island again and attack it. And they take about a year, more or less, year and a half to do that. And while this is happening, of course, there is a massive outbreak of smallpox inside of the city, because when the Spaniards first came into the city, some of the soldiers were actually sick with smallpox. So that was just enough for the virus to spread among the population. So even though the Spanish retreated, the virus stayed inside of the city. And of course, people started dying in great numbers. And this is something that Cortés was not really aware. Well, he was actually preparing the counteroffensive, but by the time he moved into the city, finally in 1521, why he was able to conquer such a large city, which was densely populated, is because when he arrived, the Aztec leadership had been already decimated. Many of the leaders, the military commanders, for example, soldiers, and the population were dying right and left. In 1521, about 100,000 people had died already. So that weakened the Aztec Empire from within. The Aztec military was also shattered as well, and that pretty much facilitated the conquest of the Aztecs by Cortés. And it was more so the effect of epidemics, more so than the effects of military strategy or military technology and weaponry, which was also significant, but it was more epidemics. The other empire is the Inca Empire. Once the Spaniards take over central Mexico, they were also informed about another empire to the south that had a lot of gold as well. So they're going to send another expedition. And in 1532, we're going to see the arrival of other conquistadors that will also conquer the Inca Empire in only a matter of years, from 1532 to 1536. And part of this has to do with also an epidemic outbreak that had affected the Inca Empire and weakened the Inca military as well and the leadership as well. And here, again, we're talking about an expedition of no more than 400 soldiers, again, being able to subdue an empire that contained about 10 million, people. Okay, the Inca Empire was densely populated. However, most of the people lived in the highlands, again, in the mountains, high in the mountains. There was a high concentration of people living in the mountains. So keep that in mind, because this is also going to help explain why there will be a high survival rate in the Inca Empire of the epidemic disease, because people tended to live, again, in highlands as well. Okay, so this is the map of the Inca Empire. As you can see, along the Pacific coast of South America. It's a vast, also, territorial domain. And what we know from records is that even before the Spaniards showed up in 1532, there was already an outbreak of smallpox, in the Inca Empire. Okay, And the reason for this has to do with the trade routes. Once again, there were trade routes that connected the Caribbean with Mexico, Central, South America, and the like. And as merchants were moving merchandise, commercial goods along, they were also moving now the smallpox along with them. Okay, so even before the Spaniards showed up, there was already a massive outbreak of epidemic disease. Now, this epidemic disease that broke out in the 1520s in the heart of the Inca Empire, and this epidemic led to civil war, and it led to civil war because the emperor himself, Huayna Capac, died in 1528, and as he's dying, he was considered really the incarnation of the sun god. So this is really, really shattering for people. Now, how is it that the emperor, is affected by this? In other words, as he's dying, he left one of his sons as the successor to the throne. But his own son also died from smallpox in 1528. Okay, so from 1526 to 1528, we have in sequence the emperor and his son dying. And all members of the royal family were dying, and many people were dying as well. So this is creating instability, of course. And part of the instability had to do with now a war between two brothers, which were also sons of Huayna Capac. Atahualpa and Huascar were now fighting for the throne. There was a vacuum of power, and they're both fighting over the throne. And that led to a civil war. Again, a civil war caused by epidemics. Atahualpa ended up winning the struggle. He installed himself as the new emperor. And just at the time that he now is declared the emperor of the Inca Empire, Francisco Pizarro, the conquistador, shows up in 1532 with a small band of soldiers, about 400 of them or so. They meet with Atahualpa in the town of Cajamarca in the northern part of the Inca Empire. They have dinner. But at the end of the event, there was an ambush. Atahualpa and his followers are ambushed by the Spanish soldiers, and they arrest Atahualpa. The Spaniards arrest Atahualpa, and they ask for gold for ransom. In other words, look, we're willing to liberate you, the emperor, if you fill, they say, a whole room full of gold. If you can fill this room full of gold, we'll set you free. So he ordered his followers, Atahualpa ordered all his followers to go to every corner of the empire to bring the gold. And they indeed filled a gigantic room full of gold. And after he does that, Atahualpa is then killed by the Spaniards, of course. Okay. And from there, the Spaniards are now engaged in this massive conquest. They're moving into different places, subduing populations. And as they're moving from region to region, this is facilitated, the conquest, by the presence of epidemic disease. So the empire had become weakened. The Inca military had become weakened as well as a result of the epidemics. And that, again, led to the conquest of the Incas in 1536. Now, what is the result? The result is, from this point, we see pandemics in the Americas. Again, it is going to spread, several diseases spreading across the Americas. This is facilitated by the efforts of the Spanish to evangelize the natives, to spread Christianity. In order to do so, they're reconcentrating populations. They're bringing together people to live in towns, supervised by the priest. And when they do that, when they reconcentrate populations, that, of course, facilitated the spread of disease. And we see massive outbreaks of different viruses like measles in the 1530s across the Americas. We have, of course, pneumonic plague in Mexico in the 1540s, in Mexico City. Smallpox in South America in the 1580s. There's another episode of massive spread of disease. And also smallpox affects North American Native American groups in the 1600s when the French, the Dutch, and the British show up as well. So it's a massive pandemic. Now, of course, people that tended to live in the lowlands were largely affected by the pandemics, whereas people that live in the highlands kind of were affected the least, let us just say. So there was a geographical factor in this. This is very important to note. Again, cooler areas in the highlands were less prone to lead to the spread of disease. And the populations were sparsely also, you know, uh, located as well. They were pretty much less concentrated as well. Okay. Uh, the effects of pandemics in the Americas is that this led to a population catastrophe, 90% decline. So it went down from, let us just say, 60 million, or you want to say 120 million, to 90% reduction by 1650. Again, so the effect of pandemics in the Americas is that this led to a shortage of labor. Less and less people are available to grow food. So this is leading to famine. That compounded also the problem. Famine, remember, famine leads to compromised immune systems and more death. Now, the shortage of labor and the famine also led to demographic change because the colonizers, in this case, the Spaniards and later on the Portuguese, are trying to get, some labor for their farms, for their plantations, and their landed estates. Somebody has to grow the food, in other words, to maintain the colonial societies. So the solution for this was the introduction of African populations. We have the introduction of African slaves, in other words. They're being brought into the Americas in order to grow, the food, the cash crops like sugar, tobacco, rice, coffee, and the like, cotton, for exports. So we see now a demographic change in that we see the introduction of African populations. By 1650, we see a recovery of Native American populations recovering from the pandemics in that they're now the survivors were able to develop some resistance and immunity to the disease. And of course, the strands of viruses that had affected them as well are growing weaker and weaker over time. So there's going to be a rebound after 1650. The Native American population is going to rebound and recover to their previous levels as well, again, after 1650. And so we also have an increase of Native American societies, and of course, a blend of Native American with European and also with African as well. So the demographic, composition, again, is also changing as well as a result of the epidemics as well. Now, in summary, we have seen three historical forces, leading up to the early modern world, changing the old institutions, shattering them, and giving rise to new ones. We have, for example, long distance trade. This is the first historical force we saw, tying societies together, bringing societies together, tying their economies through trade, and also facilitating the rapid spread of cultures and religions around the world, and also technologies as well. Again, this is the precursor to modernity and globalization, a more integrated world socially, economically, and culturally as well. By 1500, this has already, again, a very well-established international network where the cultures, the technologies, the ideas, the commercial goods are flowing from one end of the globe to another. Again, the other historical force is climate change that alter the relationships between nomads and sedentary groups, leading to the nomadic invasions. The nomads are invading the sedentary societies, like the Mongols invading, China, for example, the Vikings in Europe, and so on. And that led to new empires based on warfare, expansion through warfare, but also through trade as well. And this is leading to the prototypical type of trading empire of the modern world, which was the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire served as a blueprint for the rise of the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal, for example, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the English, the French empires, and so on. Again, so this is another very important force. The other was epidemics and pandemics as well. It's another force that led to also the global exchange of germs through the networks, again, that we already talked about. We see merchants traveling from one end to the other of the globe. And with that, we see the transmission of epidemic disease, which led to the massive, not only dying of populations, but also the crumbling of institutions, political, religious institutions, and even economic institutions are crumbling, like feudalism is crumbling, giving rise to capitalism. The church is crumbling, giving rise to things like modern science, for example, and empires like the Mongols and the Aztecs and the Inca empires are also crumbling, giving rise, of course, to new societies as well that are going to be based on mercantilism and capitalism, as we'll see much later in this course. Again, we have, of course, changing demographics. The demographics of the world are also changing as a result of those pandemics. And that is because in the Americas, with the Great Dying, there was the need to introduce the Spanish and the Portuguese, the need to introduce uh, populations from other areas of the world, in this case from Africa, in order to serve as labor to produce what needed to be produced to sustain their colonial societies and the products of their enterprises as well. Again, so we have, of course, a changing world, a world that is now rapidly going to be characterized by the uh, ideas of modernity and globalization, more integrated, more commercially driven, and more diverse as well. Okay, so this is all I have for you. Uh, in the next topic, we're going to be moving now into the rise of trading empires, and I will provide an introduction once we initiate the first session of the next topic. Thank you.